Welcome my dear students to the reteach. In the continuation of the previous session, now we are going to learn the constraints in a relational data model. What are the constraints? The constraints are nothing but the rules and the regulations that we apply on the attributes or the columns for the entry of the data into the relation. On data modeling, the relational database, we can apply some rules or conditions like what values allowed into the relation for particular attribute. Here, the constraints are the rules that are enforced on the data columns of the table. They are used to limit the data type or the type of the data that we can enter into the table. Here, the constraints ensures different things. What are they? It ensures the accuracy and reliability. The accuracy means the correct data that has to be entered as an entry to that column, and reliability means the exact data when we can access the data from the table. So these both can be satisfied with the help of constraints. Constraints can be applied on either table or column. Look into this. We can apply a constraint either on a table or a column. That means first we can apply the constraint on the column of a table or onto the entire table can apply the constraint. And the type of constraint, domain constraint. In DBMS table, a table is viewed as set of columns and rows. It is the general thing that we know that a table is considered and viewed as set of rows and columns. Hence, if you want to exact the data or valid data, that means if you want the exact data or valid data to be entered into a column, like that means the data what we are entering into the column, it must be exact and valid. For the assurance of exact and validity, we are applying the domain constraint. Like see the example already we have discussed in the previous one. For a month, what are the entries? January, February, March. For the gender, what are the entries? Male, female or other, which is nothing but transgender. Here, consider the domain constraints ensures two things. What are they? First one, whether the data value entered for the particular column matches with the data type defined by the column. First we need to check whether the data entering into the column should match with the data type what we define to that column, and these things are considered or controlled with these those are not null, unique, primary key, foreign key. Not null, unique, primary key and foreign key. Here we are going to study the domain constraint with an example. See this example. I considered a student table with roll number, name and age. And on age, I am applying the constraint, that means domain constraint, as the age must be greater than 18. Come across this example in the election e-rolls also. The age of the entry must be more than 18 or not equal to 18. There, in that condition, age is greater than or equal to 18. Here for the student, I am making an entry as greater than 18. So on this data, that means on age data, I am applying the domain constraint as age must be greater than 18. Look here, age is considered as the domain and the domain constraint is as age must be greater than 18 years and it must be an integer Like this, the domain constraint is defined like this: data type, check for domain plus constraint. Now we are going to study about how we can define the domain constraint with an example. Please closely observe this one. If you want to create a student table with student ID, field name and columns having values greater than 10, that means the student ID must have the values which are greater than 10 or above 30 and they must be an integer. Here observe this how we are creating the domain constraint for the student table by defining the domain name also. Here we are creating the domain as ID value and it must be integer and the constraint is id value, and we are checking that as value is greater than or equal to 30. How we can define this in the definition of the table? Observe here. We can define this in the definition of the table as roll number, the first attribute, student name, the second attribute, student age, the third attribute, and for the id it must be integer, and id value, already we defined this id value here by checking the condition as greater than or equal to 30. So the constraint what we defined, the domain constraint what we defined here is applicable in this relation. How it is applicable in this relation? What is the output of this one? Observe this table. Observe here all the entries in the id are greater than or equal to 30. For the roll number 3, 1, 33, 40, 2, 7, for all these entries, the IDs are more than 30. Look into the each entry. So this table follows the domain constraint what we defined. That is, ID must be greater than or equal to 30, which is applied here. The next one, we can recheck this with another example. I want to create a table with the name bank account, and I want to make the domain constraint on the account type. How many account types are available in general? For example, there are two types are available. One is savings account, another one is current account. We can put a domain constraint. The entry to the account type must be two types. Either it is savings or current account. For that one, I am going to define the domain as create domain account type, which is of type, that means data type character, and the constraint what I am checking is account type test check the value in. Why I am keeping the word as in means it must be either among the two, that is the current or savings. That's why I placed it as in, value in the current or savings. Now I am going to define the definition of the table. Create table bank account with the first column as account number, which is the primary key, an important one, and the account holder name, account type, that means along with the domain constraint. Here is the domain constraint. What is the domain constraint? Account type. What the account type has to be? Already we defined it as the current or savings. So when the definition is created, the data is allowed only with respect to the domain constraint, that is current or savings. See the entries of the table. Here the domain constraint applied on this table like this. What is that? The domain constraint for the account type has only two things, that is the savings or current. Once again observe this, the savings or the current. So only two entries are allowed for the account type. Maybe the account number and the account holder names will change as per the entries to the records, that means to the tuples, but the account type must be savings and current depending upon this domain constraint. Thank you, my dear students. This is about the introduction of the constraints. Now we are going to study about more constraints in the coming session. Thank you so much.